The housemaid heard the millionaire's daughter crying every night. But it was one particular night when Laura, compelled by something deeper than mere curiosity, stepped into Amy's world and was horrified by what she uncovered. The first light of dawn began to break as Laura stirred awake, jolted by the screeching clang of her alarm clock. Blinking a few times, she adjusted to the pale dimness of her tiny, windowless maid's quarters tucked away in the Collins mansion. The chill in the room was biting. She exhaled softly, watching her breath condense into faint clouds. Another day, she thought, a dull weariness sinking into her bones. Another day of endless labor. Dragging herself from the warmth of her bed, Laura winced as her bare feet met the icy wooden floor. She quickly shoved on her worn-out slippers and moved into the small adjoining bathroom. The mirror hanging above the sink was cracked and streaked, but it reflected back a woman changed by years of servitude. Laura, 35, brown hair pulled into an unforgiving bun, hazel eyes dulled by exhaustion. Fine lines creased her face, lines that spoke of nights spent working and dreams forgotten long ago. "When did I become so old?" she murmured, fingertips grazing the faint wrinkles around her eyes. "It feels like just yesterday I arrived here young, hopeful, and full of ambition." With a sigh that echoed her quiet resignation, Laura tied her apron snugly and stepped out, descending the narrow service stairs into the still silent heart of the mansion. The Collins family still slumbered, safe in their opulent rooms. The house, despite its splendor, felt more like a mausoleum, cold, vast, and lifeless. The kitchen was her sanctuary, immaculate as always. She set to work with practiced precision: eggs Benedict, toasted artisan bread, freshly squeezed orange juice, and the rich aroma of Colombian coffee, which was ground to Mr. Collins' exacting standards. For a moment she allowed herself a small pleasure. She paused, inhaling deeply, letting the scent of coffee remind her that small comforts still existed even here. At exactly 7:30 a.m., as expected, Laura ascended the grand staircase with the breakfast tray. Each creaking step echoed like a clock ticking, counting down to another silent confrontation. Outside the master bedroom, she knocked gently. "Come in," came Richard Collins' deep, curt voice from within. Laura pushed the door open and stepped into a room of overwhelming grandeur. The enormous bed, draped in crisp sheets and silk covers, dwarfed everything else in the room. Sitting at the center of it was Richard Collins, middle-aged, with graying hair neatly combed, and eyes that were sharper than any blade. His laptop lay open, the faint glow from the screen illuminating his face. "Good morning, sir," Laura greeted evenly, placing the tray on the table. "Your breakfast." Richard barely spared her a glance, his focus fixed on the screen. He gave a dismissive wave toward the bedside table. "Put it there." Laura obeyed silently, setting the tray down with care. The faint scent of Richard's cologne mixed oddly with the clean, sterile scent of freshly laundered linen. She didn't belong here, amid such wealth, where humanity felt absent. Richard's voice, sudden and sharp, broke the silence. "Do I need to remind you that Mrs. Collins returns from her trip tonight?" Laura froze, momentarily startled, but her voice remained steady. "No, sir. I've already prepared her room and will begin her favorite dinner this evening." Richard finally looked at her, his cold gaze lingering on her face, just a moment too long, as though weighing her worth. "Good, you may go." She bowed her head respectfully and slipped out of the room, shutting the heavy door quietly behind her. Only then, as the sound of the latch clicked, did she let out the breath she'd been holding. To him, I'm invisible, she thought bitterly as she descended the stairs. A cog in his perfectly oiled machine, nothing more. The day passed in a monotonous rhythm of chores: scrubbing floors, pressing linens, polishing silver. Laura floated through the Collins mansion like a shadow, unseen and unheard, her presence reduced to mere utility. Even the other staff, the butler, John the gardener, Jack the security chief, existed in quiet isolation, each buried under their own burden of responsibilities. By the time night arrived, fatigue clawed at her body. Her feet throbbed, her back screamed, and she longed for the cold comfort of her narrow bed. She had just begun folding the last of the freshly laundered sheets when a sound reached her ears, soft, faint, but unmistakable. It was crying. Laura froze, her hands still gripping the linen. She tilted her head, listening harder. There it was again, a muffled sob, tinged with agony. It came from upstairs, from Amy's room. Her chest tightened. Laura knew the sound all too well. She had heard it before, though never quite this raw, this desperate. "It's none of my business," she told herself firmly, forcing her hands to move again. "What happens in this family stays behind closed doors." But the sobbing continued, growing louder. Each broken cry gnawed at something deep within her. Her resolve crumbled. Unable to bear it any longer, Laura placed the last sheet carefully into the closet and left the laundry room. The mansion was dark now, save for the faint moonlight filtering through the tall, ornate windows. Laura moved quietly, her footsteps almost soundless on the marble floors. Every beat of her heart drummed louder in her chest as she approached Amy's room. Reaching the door, she hesitated. The sobs were clearer now, gasping breaths punctuated by the kind of pain no one should endure. "What am I doing?" she asked herself, her hand hovering over the doorknob. "This isn't my place." But another cry, raw and shattering, broke through her doubt. Tears pricked at the corners of Laura's eyes as she knocked gently. "Miss Amy," she called softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you all right?" The crying stopped suddenly. A tense silence filled the air. Laura waited, her pulse quickening with every second that stretched between them. The hallway felt suffocating now, pressing in on her from all sides. Then, finally, a trembling voice came from the other side of the door. "Laura? Is that you?" Amy's voice, so fragile, so far from the confident young woman Laura had grown accustomed to, broke something inside her. Swallowing the lump in her throat, Laura answered. "Yes, miss, I heard something and wanted to make sure you were all right. May I come in?" There was a pause, then the sound of hesitant footsteps. The doorknob turned slowly, and when the door opened, Laura had to steady herself. Amy stood there, disheveled and broken, her blonde hair hanging limply around her face. Her eyes, once so full of light, were red and swollen, circled with shadows of sleepless nights. The silk pajamas she wore were wrinkled, stained with tears. She wrapped her arms tightly around herself, as if trying to hold her very being together. Laura's breath caught. She had seen Amy smiling in designer gowns and perfectly styled makeup, the picture of privilege and grace. But this was someone else entirely. "Oh, Miss Amy," Laura whispered, her heart aching as she stepped into the room. And in that moment, as their eyes met, Laura knew she couldn't look away anymore. The sight before Laura was so unexpected, so profoundly unsettling, that she felt her throat tighten, cutting off her breath. "Come in," Amy whispered, her voice so faint it barely reached Laura's ears. "Quick, before someone sees." Laura obeyed instinctively, slipping into the room and closing the heavy door behind her with practiced care. The soft click of the latch seemed to echo in the stillness. Amy's room was a testament to luxury, a gilded cage painted in soft shades of ivory and blush pink. A sprawling king-size bed dominated the space, its silk bedspread untouched and perfect except for the young woman, who now sat slumped on its edge, her shoulders caved in defeat. The walls, lined with expensive paintings and mirrors that gleamed under the golden light of the lamps, offered a cruel contrast to Amy's visible turmoil. The very elegance of the room made the tragedy within it feel all the more wrong. Laura hesitated by the door, her hands wringing the edges of her apron. "Miss Amy," she began softly, the hesitation clear in her tone. "What's wrong? Is there anything I can do to help?" Amy's head lifted slowly, her blue eyes swollen and rimmed with tears met Laura's. In those eyes, Laura saw everything: fear, despair, and something she hadn't expected: relief. For a moment, Amy seemed to wrestle with herself, her lips quivering as though trying to hold back her words. But then, the dam broke. "Oh, Laura," Amy choked out, her voice fractured and small. "I don't know what to do. I can't take this anymore." The quiet desperation in her voice broke something inside Laura. Without a second thought, she crossed the room and sat beside Amy on the soft mattress. The bed sank slightly beneath their weight, and for a moment Laura felt the faint, shivering warmth of the girl beside her. "Tell me, Miss Amy," Laura murmured gently, fighting the urge to wrap a comforting arm around her. The unspoken boundary of status between them loomed large, but the humanity of the moment eclipsed it. "Whatever it is, just tell me. Maybe I can help." Amy inhaled sharply, the breath shaky and uneven. She stared down at her trembling hands for a long moment, then finally spoke, her voice no more than a fragile whisper. "It's my father," she said, barely able to meet Laura's eyes. He wants me to get married." Laura's brow furrowed. Marriage? Marriage in families like the Collins was often a grand affair, a celebration of wealth and power. What could possibly make Amy look so broken? "But Miss Amy," Laura asked cautiously, "isn't marriage supposed to be a good thing? A celebration?" Amy let out a bitter laugh, one that sounded more like a sob caught in her throat. The hollow sound echoed against the ornate walls, as if mocking her. "Not when the groom is someone my father chose to strengthen his business," she said, each word laced with sharp, biting bitterness. "The man is older than him, Laura. I don't even know him." The weight of those words hit Laura like a punch. She had always known Richard Collins was a hard, calculating man, a businessman whose ambition knew no limits. But this level of cruelty was more than she had imagined. Laura's voice trembled slightly as she forced herself to stay calm. "But Miss Amy, surely Mr. Collins can't force you into a marriage you don't want. That's not legal." Amy shrugged, her frail shoulders sagging even further, her expression one of quiet defeat. "Legal or not, he'll find a way," she murmured, her voice flat and resigned. "He always does." For a moment Laura sat in silence, absorbing the gravity of what Amy had just said. Her mind raced, searching for answers where there seemed to be none. "And your mother?" she asked, clutching at the faintest sliver of hope. "Can't she step in?" Fresh tears glistened on Amy's cheeks as she shook her head. "She's in Europe, shopping." Again Amy said with a sardonic twist of her lips, lifting her hands to form mocking air quotes. The gesture made her look painfully young, too young to carry this much weight. "But even if she were here, she wouldn't help. She never stands up to him. She never stands up for me." Laura felt something inside her snap. How could they treat Amy, this kind, fragile soul, as though she were nothing more than a pawn to be moved across a chessboard, a bargaining chip for power? Her voice, when she spoke, surprised even her. "Miss Amy, this isn't right," Laura said firmly, her hands clenching into fists. "We can't let this happen." Amy looked up, startled by the determination in Laura's voice. For the first time, a faint flicker of hope shimmered in her tear-streaked eyes. "But what can we do?" she whispered. "My father is powerful. What chance do we have?" Laura hesitated. The logical part of her screamed that this wasn't her fight, that stepping into the storm Richard Collins had created would lead only to disaster. She was a maid and nobody. What power did she have to stand up to a man like him? And yet, looking at Amy's face, so young, so scared, yet pleading for help, Laura felt something ignite within her. A quiet, unwavering resolve she hadn't known she possessed. She reached out, taking Amy's trembling hands in her own. "I don't know yet," Laura admitted softly, her voice steady despite the knot in her throat. "But I promise you this, we'll find a way out. I'll help you. We'll figure it out. Together." Amy stared at her, searching her face as though trying to see if the promise was real. Slowly, cautiously, A small, fragile smile curved her lips, a smile that seemed to carry the faintest spark of hope. "Thank you, Laura," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know what I'd do without you." A lump formed in Laura's throat. She knew the risks. If Richard Collins ever found out, the consequences would be dire for both of them. But looking at Amy now, Laura knew there was no turning back. "You're not alone, Miss Amy," Laura said quietly, squeezing her hands gently. "We'll face this. Together." The two women sat in silence, the air between them thick with unspoken fears and a newfound bond. Outside, the world was still, the night cloaking the Collins mansion in quiet indifference. But within these walls, something had shifted, an alliance had been born. Laura knew the days ahead would test their courage. They would need to be smart, careful, and impossibly brave. But no matter what happens, she thought fiercely, I will protect her. I will help her find freedom, whatever the cost. As the days wore on, a suffocating tension settled like dust over the Collins mansion. Laura, suddenly attuned to the smallest details, walked its polished corridors with an unease she couldn't shake. The grandeur that once seemed so impressive now loomed oppressive, heavy with shadows that seemed to whisper secrets only she dared to hear. One frigid morning, Laura found herself in Richard Collins' office. The familiar sense of polished mahogany and rich leather mingled with the sharp tang of whiskey forgotten in a crystal tumbler on the desk. The silence felt weighty, as though the room itself were holding its breath. Laura moved carefully, her cloth gliding over the pristine surfaces, her thoughts restless. How much wealth was poured into this room? She wondered, her gaze drifting over the gleaming desk, the hand-carved shelves, and the ostentatious decor. And at what cost? It was while dusting a collection of leather-bound books that Laura noticed it. One volume a little too far forward. Her pulse quickened. She hesitated, glancing toward the closed door, as if Richard himself might storm in at any moment. Curiosity, however, won out. She reached for the book, but instead of sliding it off the shelf, there was a quiet click. Laura froze as an entire section of the bookshelf shifted, revealing a hidden compartment. What in the world? Her heart thundered in her chest as she knelt to peer inside. Trembling fingers reached for a thick leather folder tucked neatly within the space. With a deep breath, she opened it. What she saw made the room spin. Pages upon pages of documents, complex financial statements, lists of transactions, and names she recognized from news headlines, prominent politicians, massive figures. Scattered among them were incriminating phrases: offshore accounts, money laundering, bribery. Laura's stomach churned. Dear God, what is this man involved in? The sound of approaching footsteps jolted her back to the present. Panic gripped her. Shoving the folder back into its hiding place, she slid the shelf closed and turned, her duster once again in hand. Her heart pounded as the office door swung open. Richard Collins entered, his presence filling the room like a winter chill. His sharp eyes swept over her, narrowing as they landed. What are you doing here? His voice, cold and edged, cut through the silence. Laura forced her lips into a smile, praying it didn't betray the terror clawing at her. Just routine cleaning, sir, she said lightly, holding up the duster as if it might shield her. Richard's gaze lingered, his expression unreadable but heavy with suspicion. For a moment Laura felt certain he could see right through her, that he somehow knew. Sweat prickled at her hairline. Finally, he gave a curt nod. Very well. Finish quickly and get out. I have work to do. Yes, sir, she murmured, her voice barely audible. Laura's legs felt like lead as she hurried to complete her tasks. Only when she had escaped the office and shut the door behind her did she let her shoulders sag. Leaning against the cold hallway wall, she drew in shaky breaths. What have I uncovered? The weight of what she'd seen pressed down on her. What am I supposed to do now? That night, the mansion was cloaked in silence. When the last light had gone out and the echoes of footsteps had faded, Laura crept toward Amy's room. Her heart raced with every step, but she knew she couldn't keep this to herself. Knocking softly, she eased the door open to find Amy sitting on the edge of her bed. A book lay open in her lap, but her eyes stared blankly at nothing. At the sound of Laura's voice, she started, then visibly relaxed. "Oh, Laura," Amy said softly, her voice brittle. "Please come in." Laura slipped inside, shutting the door quietly behind her. The dim glow of the bedside lamp cast long shadows, making the room feel smaller somehow. Laura perched on the edge of the bed, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. I need to tell you something," she began. Her voice wavered as she described what she'd discovered that morning. Every detail, the documents, the hidden compartment, the terrifying implications spilled out. Amy's face paled as Laura spoke. By the time she finished, the young woman's blue eyes were wide with both fear and grim understanding. "I always knew my father had secrets," Amy whispered, her voice cracking. "But I never imagined it was this." Laura studied the girl, her slumped shoulders, the fresh tears glistening on her cheeks, and her heart broke. "Miss Amy, how long has your father had this hold over you?" Amy sighed heavily, dragging a trembling hand through her disheveled hair. "My whole life. He controls everything, what I wear, who I speak to, what I study. He's mapped out my entire future, and I don't have a say in any of it." Laura swallowed hard. "And your mother? Doesn't she see what's happening?" Amy's laugh was bitter, almost cruel in its hopelessness. "My mother," she scoffed. "She's in Europe, shopping her life away, pretending none of this exists. Even if she were here, she wouldn't do anything. She never does." The room fell silent. The weight of Amy's words hung heavy between them, and Laura could feel the girl's fear palpable, suffocating. Finally, Amy's voice broke the quiet. "I'm scared, Laura. I'm scared of what my father will do if I refuse to marry. And now, knowing what you found, if he discovers that we know." Her words trailed off, but the meaning was clear. Without thinking, Laura reached for Amy's hands, holding them firmly in her own. "I won't let him hurt you," Laura said, her voice stronger than she felt. "We'll find a way, together." Amy blinked, fresh tears welling in her eyes. "How? My father has power everywhere. What chance do we have?" Laura hesitated, her mind racing. Finally she spoke. "If we can gather proof of his illegal dealings, real, undeniable proof, we can use it to force his hand. He'll have no choice but to leave you alone." Amy stared at her, the tiniest flicker of hope breaking through her despair. "You mean blackmail?" Laura shook her head firmly. "Not blackmail, Miss Amy. Leverage. If we threaten to expose him, it might be enough to make him back down." Amy was silent, her gaze searching Laura's face. Finally she nodded, the faintest spark of resolve lighting her eyes. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's do it, together." Laura nodded, a mix of fear and fierce determination flooding through her. She knew the risks. If Richard Collins found out, the consequences would be unimaginable. But as she looked at Amy, the fragile girl who, for the first time, showed a glimmer of strength, Laura knew there was no turning back. "I will protect her," Laura vowed silently, "no matter what it takes." The first light of dawn spilled weakly through the frost-tinged windows of the Collins mansion as Laura sat upright in her narrow bed. Anxiety twisted in her chest, its tight grip reminding her that today was no ordinary day. Silently she dressed, careful not to wake anyone. The maid's quarters, already small, felt suffocating, as if the walls themselves bore the weight of the secret she carried. Today it begins, she thought, her heart pounding in her ears. Today we stand up to Richard Collins. Steeling herself, Laura slipped out of her room. The mansion lay silent, shrouded in the quiet of early morning, but she knew that silence wouldn't last. Moving quickly, she entered the kitchen and fell into the familiar rhythm of preparing Richard Collins' lavish breakfast. Her hands, usually steady, shook slightly as she cracked the eggs and set the coffee to brew, its rich aroma rising into the air. Stay calm. Stay normal, she told herself, her mind racing through the plan she and Amy had painstakingly crafted the night before. It was a dangerous gamble, one that could upend everything. The sudden thud of heavy boots jolted her from her thoughts. Laura turned to find John, the gardener, standing in the doorway. His face, usually calm, was lined with fatigue, but beneath that was something sharper fear. "Morning, Laura," John muttered, his voice low and strained. Laura paused, studying him. John had always been a quiet, unobtrusive presence, but in recent days she'd noticed a shift in edginess, a furtive look in his eyes. "Good morning, John," she replied cautiously. "Is everything all right?" John glanced toward the hallway, as if ensuring they were alone. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Laura, I need to speak with you. It's important." Laura's pulse quickened. Did John know? Had he somehow discovered the plan she and Amy had devised? "What is it?" she asked, forcing her voice to remain steady. John inhaled deeply, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "I know what Richard Collins is doing," he said quietly, "and I know you and Miss Amy are planning something to stop him." The blood seemed to drain from Laura's face. Her fingers curled tightly around the edge of the counter. "I don't know what you're talking about," she began, trying to sound dismissive. John raised a hand, cutting her off. "Don't lie to me, Laura. I saw you two talking in the garden last night, but listen, I'm not here to stop you. I want to help." Laura blinked, stunned into silence. She searched John's face, looking for any sign of deceit, but what she saw instead was a mix of determination and desperation. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why would you risk yourself to help us?" John's gaze fell to his rough, calloused hands. When he spoke again, his voice trembled with the weight of years of buried fear. "Because Richard Collins doesn't just torment his daughter. He's been blackmailing me for years, threatening to deport my family if I didn't do exactly what he said. I can't live like this anymore, Laura. I can't keep letting him control me." Compassion rose like a wave in Laura's chest. She reached out, resting a gentle hand on John's arm. "Oh, John," she said softly, her voice thick with sympathy. "I had no idea. I'm so sorry." John offered her a sad, weary smile. "No one knew. That's how he keeps us all silent." He paused, his voice firming with newfound resolve. "But we have a chance now together. We can stop him." Laura hesitated, her mind spinning as the implications sank in. John's help could mean the difference between success and failure. Finally, she nodded. "All right," she said, her voice steadying. "We'll talk to Amy tonight. Together, we'll figure out a better plan." That night, when the mansion finally sank into its slumber, Laura, Amy, and John gathered in Amy's room. The tension was thick, each of them acutely aware of the risk they were about to take. Amy looked at John, a flicker of suspicion in her tear-rimmed eyes. "Are you sure we can trust him?" she whispered to Laura. Laura met Amy's gaze and nodded firmly. "He's trapped in this nightmare just like we are, Amy. With his help, we have a much better chance." Amy exhaled slowly, then turned to face John. "All right," she said quietly, though her voice carried a newfound strength. "What do you suggest?" John leaned forward, his voice a low murmur. "Richard Collins keeps us safe in his office. I've seen him open it once when he thought no one was watching. Inside, there are folders, documents, and a hard drive. That's where he hides the proof evidence of everything he's done." Laura and Amy exchanged a glance, hope flickering between them. This could be exactly what they needed. "But how do we get into the office?" Laura asked, her brow furrowing. "It's always locked." For the first time in days, Amy's expression shifted, determination replacing the fear. "Leave that to me," she said, her eyes glinting. "I'll create a distraction, something to get my father out of the office long enough for you two to get in." A chill of apprehension crept over Laura. "Amy, are you sure? If your father finds out?" Amy cut her off with a resolute wave of her hand. "I'm done being afraid of him, Laura. It's time we fight back." John nodded, admiration clear in his eyes. "You're brave, Miss Amy. But we need to be careful, if anything goes wrong." "It won't," Amy interjected, her voice unwavering. "We'll plan every detail. We can't afford to fail." The three of them spent the rest of the night poring over the plan, every movement, every possible pitfall. By the time they finished, the sky outside had begun to lighten, streaks of pink and gold creeping over the horizon. Laura stood by the window, staring out at the awakening world beyond the mansion gates. Fear and anticipation swirled within her, each emotion fighting for dominance. In a few days, she thought, everything will change. As they quietly parted ways and retreated to their rooms, Laura felt a shift deep within her. They were no longer mere servants or a mistress bound by circumstance. Now they were something more, allies, bound together by a shared mission and an unshakable secret. Whatever dangers lay ahead, Laura knew one thing for certain: she would not fail Amy. She would see this through to the end, no matter the cost. The clock's hands pointed to 5:30 a.m., its ticking the only sound in the dark quiet of the Collins mansion. Soon, the house would awaken to its usual charade of perfection. But beneath the polished facade, something different was stirring, a silent revolt ready to break free. Laura lay on her narrow bed, staring into the shadows. Exhaustion weighed heavily on her body, yet sleep refused to come. Every step of their plan replayed in her mind, each detail, each risk, each catastrophic failure that might shatter everything. "We'll succeed," she whispered to herself, clutching at the thought like a lifeline. "We have to." But just as her eyelids finally began to close, the quiet shattered. A furious pounding erupted on her door, shaking the fragile peace she'd so desperately clung to. "Open up." Right now the voice was unmistakable. Jack, Richard Collins' relentless head of security. The threat in his tone made her blood run cold. Laura bolted upright, her breath ragged. Adrenaline roared through her veins, sending her heart into a frantic rhythm. With trembling hands, she yanked on her robe over her nightgown. "They know," her mind screamed. "They've found us. Oh God, what now?" Taking one last shaky breath, she cracked the door open. Jack stood there, looming like a storm cloud, his expression carved in stone. "Mr. Collins wants you." Now his words were sharp, his grip like iron as he seized her arm. The pressure would surely leave bruises. Laura had no choice but to stumble along, dragged through the mansion's silent halls. Her thoughts raced, panic clawing at her throat. Amy. John, where are they? Did they get caught? The doors to Richard Collins' office were flung open, and Laura was shoved inside. The room smelled of polished wood and stale whiskey, as imposing as the man who stood at its center. Richard Collins loomed behind his grand desk, his face a mask of cold fury. His steel-gray eyes locked on her, unwavering, accusatory. But it wasn't Collins who stole Laura's breath, it was Amy, sitting rigidly in a chair beside him. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with barely contained terror. "Leave us," Collins said to Jack, his voice steady but simmering with restrained anger. Jack nodded, exiting the room and closing the heavy doors behind him. Silence fell, heavy, oppressive. The only sound was the erratic thrum of Laura's heart pounding in her ears. Finally, Richard Collins spoke, his tone chillingly calm. "It seems we have a spy in this house." Laura swallowed hard, forcing herself to stand tall. "Sir, I don't know what you mean. Colin's laugh was low and humorless, like the sound of glass shattering underfoot. Don't insult me, Laura. His voice turned sharp, the veneer of civility slipping. I know what you've been up to, what you, my disgraceful daughter, and that pathetic gardener have been plotting. Collins grabbed a folder from his desk and hurled it at her feet. The contents spilled out, photographs scattered across the floor like damning confetti. Laura's heart sank. There they were, images of her and Amy whispering in corners, John slipping documents into her hands, their secret late-night meetings in the garden. Did you truly think you could deceive me? Collins snarled, his calm mask crumbling. He stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. That you could meddle in my affairs and walk away unscathed. Laura's throat went dry. Fear coiled inside her, but when she glanced at Amy, so small, so scared, something fierce sparked within her. Courage, born from desperation, straightened her spine. What you're doing is wrong, Laura said, her voice trembling but resolute. You can't force your daughter to marry someone she doesn't want. And your business, your dealings, they're illegal, and you know it. Colin's eyes darkened, his steps closing the distance between them. You don't know what you're talking about, he hissed, his face inches from hers. Who do you think you are, Laura? You're nothing. A maid, insignificant, replaceable. Laura flinched but didn't back down. Her gaze held steady. I may be just a maid, Mr. Collins, she replied, her voice steadying as her anger overpowered her fear. But even I know the difference between right and wrong. And what you're doing, what you've been doing, is wrong. Collins let out another harsh laugh, his eyes narrowing with cold malice. And what exactly do you plan to do about it? Run to the police. No one will believe you. Laura exhaled slowly, bracing herself. The moment had come. She slipped her hand into her robe pocket and pulled out a small, metallic USB drive. Its weight was reassuring, though her fingers shook. They might not believe me, she said, holding it up. But they'll believe this. Collins froze. For the first time, Laura saw something she hadn't expected: fear. It flashed in his eyes like a crack of lightning. What is that? He demanded, his voice suddenly unsteady. Laura lifted her chin. Evidence. Copies of everything you've tried to bury. The bribery, the blackmail, the illegal contracts. Collins lunged forward, his face twisted in rage, but Laura was ready. She stepped back, clutching the USB tightly. Don't even think about it, she warned, her voice sharp. There are copies. If anything happens to me or Amy, this goes straight to the authorities. For a moment she thought Collins might strike her, his hands clenched at his sides, his face contorted with fury. But then something shifted. His expression hardened into calculation, a man weighing his options, realizing he'd been cornered. What do you want? He growled, his voice low, dangerous. Laura steadied herself, her breath slow and deliberate. I want you to leave Amy alone. Call off this ridiculous marriage. Let her live her own life. And I want you to stop your illegal activities, all of them. Richard Collins let out a bitter laugh, sharp and venomous. You ask for far too much. Before Laura could respond, Amy, surprising them all, rose to her feet. Her small, trembling voice carried a strength that no one had heard before. No, Father, she's not asking for too much. She's asking for what's right. Richard turned to his daughter, his expression wavering between fury and something else: regret? Guilt? Shame? Laura couldn't quite tell. With a slow turn back toward Laura, Richard's voice hardened. And what if I refuse? Laura straightened her spine, her chin lifting with quiet resolve as she met his icy gaze. Then, this information goes public. Your business, your reputation, everything you've built will crumble. The room fell silent, heavy with tension. Laura felt the sweat tracing cold lines down her back as her heart pounded violently in her chest. She had played every card. Now all she could do was wait. The seconds dragged like hours until Richard exhaled a long, reluctant sigh. "Fine," he muttered, his voice laced with exhaustion. "You win. The marriage is off." Amy let out a soft, strangled sob of relief and rushed to Laura, wrapping her arms tightly around her. Richard watched the scene, his face unreadable, his jaw tight. "But don't think this is over," he warned coldly. "You two have 24 hours to get out of this house. And if I hear so much as a whisper of my business leaking—" The unspoken threat hung in the air, chilling Laura to her core. She nodded, pulling Amy protectively closer. "Understood. We'll be gone by tomorrow." As they left his office, Laura's relief was shadowed by a deep unease. Amy was free for now, but at what cost? The future was a great unknown, filled with uncertainties and risks. But none of that matters, Laura thought, glancing at Amy's face, soft with relief. We're together, and we're free. The clock in the Collins mansion struck midnight, each chime reverberating through the cavernous halls like the distant echo of a gunshot. Laura stood by her small window, the pale moonlight spilling across the gardens, painting them silver and still. This is it, she thought, clutching her small, worn backpack. Now or never. Every muscle in her body felt tight as she slipped out of her room and into the shadowed service corridors. Years of working in the mansion had taught her how to move silently, but tonight each creak of the floorboards seemed deafening. Laura reached Amy's door and tapped lightly 3 quick knocks. It opened almost immediately. Amy stood there, pale as a ghost, her wide blue eyes filled with both terror and determination. "Are you ready?" Laura whispered. Amy nodded, her small bag clutched tightly to her chest. "Yes," she breathed, her voice shaking. "Let's go, before I lose my nerve." They moved through the corridors like shadows, their footsteps soft, their breathing shallow. Every darkened corner, every faint sound of the old house settling made Laura's heart jump. Beside her, Amy trembled, her fear almost palpable. "Stay calm," Laura reminded herself, silently urging her own racing heart to slow. For Amy's sake. Finally, they reached the back door of the kitchen. Laura turned the handle slowly, grateful for the mansion's obsessive upkeep that ensured the hinges made no sound. The cold night air rushed in, sharp and clean, carrying the sweet scent of roses and damp grass. In the shadows, John waited. The old Ford Escort looked as tired as he did, but his face, usually kind and calm, was set with grim determination. His dark eyes scanned the darkness around them. "Hurry," he whispered, opening the car door. "We don't have much time." Laura helped Amy into the back seat before sliding into the passenger side. John turned the key, and the engine sputtered to life, its sound impossibly loud against the stillness. The car began to roll forward, slow at first, then faster as they slipped through the gates of the estate. Laura couldn't help but look back at the mansion, the towering symbol of wealth and power that had been her prison for so many years. Its darkened windows seemed to glare at her, as though the house itself resented their escape. "Goodbye," she thought, a mix of relief and dread settling in her chest. "God forgive us for what we're doing." But the moment of relief was short-lived. Suddenly, lights blazed to life across the mansion, and the distant shouting of voices pierced the night. "Damn it," John swore, his hands tightening on the wheel. "They found out." The Ford lurched forward as he floored the accelerator. The tired engine roared in protest, but the car gained speed. Laura spun around, her heart seizing as she saw 2 black SUVs tear out of the garage, their headlights blinding in the rearview mirror. "They're coming," Laura shouted, panic gripping her voice. Amy let out a strangled sob from the back seat, her hands digging into the seat so tightly her knuckles turned white. Oh God," she whimpered, tears streaming down her cheeks. John gritted his teeth, his gaze fixed ahead. "Hold on," he barked, swerving the car sharply around a corner. The old Ford groaned as though it might fall apart, but it held. The CVs were gaining, their headlights filling the interior with harsh, unforgiving light. Laura turned to John, desperation choking her. Do something. John's jaw clenched. There's a shortcut, he said tightly. Just up ahead. If we can make it there, they'll miss us. The car skidded around the bend, the tires screaming in protest. For one terrifying moment, Laura thought they'd tip over, but then the car righted itself, and John veered onto a barely visible dirt road. He killed the headlights, plunging them into near-total darkness. The car bumped and jolted over the uneven road, throwing them around as John gripped the wheel with steely focus. The roar of the CVs faded into the distance, their engines rumbling past on the main road. After a tense, breathless silence, John exhaled, his voice shaking with adrenaline. I think we lost them. Laura let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling in her lap. She turned to check on Amy, who was curled in the back seat, her face pale, streaked with tears. It's okay, Miss Amy, Laura whispered softly. We're safe now. Amy nodded weakly, her voice barely audible. I can't believe we did it. John slowed the car, the worst of the danger now behind them. I know a place where we can lay low, he said. It's a small town. I've got a friend there who'll help us. Laura closed her eyes for a moment, exhaustion replacing her fear. Thank you, John, she murmured, sincerity thick in her voice. We couldn't have done this without you. John shrugged, though a faint smile crossed his lips. Someone had to help you get out of that hellhole. The car rumbled on, the dawn beginning to brighten the horizon. For the first time, hope felt real. They were free for now. And as Laura looked at Amy, curled up and safe, she knew it was worth every risk they had taken. The hours passed in a blur, the worn wheels of the old car humming along desolate roads as darkness began to surrender to dawn. Amy had finally fallen into an uneasy sleep in the back seat, her exhaustion overtaking the waves of tension that had consumed her. Laura watched her for a moment, the young woman's face peaceful, her hand still gripping her small bag even in sleep. As the first streaks of morning light bled across the horizon, painting the sky with hues of pink and gold, the car slowed. Ahead of them lay a small, sleepy town, its streets empty and quiet. John guided the tired Ford Escort toward the outskirts, where a modest house sat tucked between tall, swaying trees. The car creaked to a stop in the gravel driveway. We're here, John murmured, his voice breaking the fragile silence. He turned off the engine and leaned back with a tired sigh. Laura turned to Amy, gently touching her shoulder to wake her. Amy stirred, blinking into consciousness. For a brief moment, confusion crossed her face, but then realization set in, and a faint smile touched her lips. Are we really free, she asked, her voice soft and tentative, as though she were afraid to believe it. Laura met her gaze, her own eyes welling with emotion. Yes, Miss Amy, she replied warmly, her voice trembling with both relief and exhaustion. We're free. The two women stepped out of the car, their breath clouding in the cool morning air. Laura paused, closing her eyes as the first rays of sunlight kissed her face. For years, this simple warmth had felt meaningless, overshadowed by a life spent in quiet servitude. But now it was different. Now it felt like freedom. When she opened her eyes, she saw Amy doing the same, her face tilted toward the rising sun, a look of pure, fragile joy spreading across her features. This is the start, Laura thought, watching her. A new beginning. A beginning without chains. John had already made his way to the front door, speaking in hushed tones to a middle-aged man with a kind face and weary eyes, his friend, their lifeline. Laura gathered her small backpack in Amy's bag before turning back to her. She extended her hand, her voice soft but steady. Shall we? Amy nodded, sliding her hand into Laura's. Together they walked toward the house, leaving behind the mansion, the shadows of fear, and the grip of Richard Collins. Their steps felt lighter somehow, though Laura knew the road ahead was far from easy. No matter what lies ahead, Laura thought, glancing at Amy, we'll face it together. The following morning, under a sky once again streaked with pinks and oranges, Laura and Amy stood before the looming structure of the police station. Its red brick walls and sharp angles gave it an imposing, almost intimidating presence. Laura could feel Amy trembling beside her, her hand squeezing Laura's tightly. "It's going to be all right," Laura whispered, her voice firm but kind. "We're doing the right thing." Amy took a shaky breath, her blue eyes weary but resolute as she looked at the station's heavy doors. She's grown so much, Laura thought with a pang of both pride and sorrow. How unfair that it took so much pain for her to find this strength. They climbed the stone steps together, their footsteps echoing against the quiet morning. Inside, the air was sharp with the smell of stale coffee and paperwork. A uniformed officer behind the front desk looked up, his expression professional but inquisitive. "Can I help you?" he asked, his eyes assessing the two women standing before him. Laura swallowed, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Yes," she said, her tone firmer than she felt. "We need to speak to someone. We have information about illegal activities." The officer frowned slightly, his gaze sharpening. "Illegal activities? What kind?" Amy stepped forward then, her voice trembling at first, but gaining strength with each word. "Fraud, blackmail, influence peddling. We have evidence." For a moment, the officer simply stared, as though unsure what to make of them. Then, with a curt nod, he stood. "Wait here. I'll get the detective on duty." As they waited in the cold, sterile room, Laura studied Amy's pale but determined expression. Pride swelled in her chest, mixed with a fierce protectiveness. "No matter what happens," Laura promised herself, "I'll stand by her." A few moments later, a man in his late 40s entered, his face lined with weariness and the quiet authority of someone who had seen too much. He introduced himself with a simple nod. "I'm Detective Samuel. I understand you have information to share." They followed him into a small, windowless room dominated by a metal table. The air inside felt heavy, faintly scented with disinfectant. Laura and Amy took their seats across from the detective. Samuel's eyes, sharp and calculating, fixed on Amy as she spoke. "It's about my father, Richard Collins," Amy said, her voice steady but soft. At the mention of the name, Samuel's eyebrows lifted slightly, though he kept his composure. "The businessman?" he asked, jotting something in his notepad. "Go on." Over the next few hours, Amy and Laura told him everything. Amy spoke of her father's suffocating control, his veiled threats, and his cruel determination to force her into a loveless marriage. Laura presented the documents, clear proof of Richard's illegal dealings, blackmail, bribes, fraud. Detective Samuel listened carefully, his expression stoic but his body tense. He asked questions now and then, each one measured, his notes filling the pages quickly. By the time the truth had been laid bare, the sun outside stood high in the sky. Laura felt drained, as though the weight of the past had been poured out with each word. She looked to Amy, who sat slumped in her chair, equally spent but visibly lighter, as though a burden had finally been lifted. Detective Samuel leaned back, his face thoughtful, his voice grave. "What you've given me," he said slowly, "is explosive. It will take time to build the case, but I assure you we're going to act on this." Amy's eyes glistened with tears of relief. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. Laura placed a hand gently on her shoulder, offering quiet reassurance. "What happens now?" she asked the detective. Samuel's gaze softened slightly. "Now we focus on keeping you safe. We'll place you both into witness protection until this investigation is over." Laura exhaled, her body sagging with the weight of everything they'd endured. They weren't out of danger yet, but for the first time the path forward was clear. Amy turned to her, offering a tearful but hopeful smile. Laura squeezed her hand gently, feeling the strength between them, two women who had faced the worst and survived. Whatever comes next, Laura thought, we'll face it side by side. The following weeks swept by like a storm. Laura and Amy were moved to a quiet, secure, safe house, where time seemed to stand still. Their days were spent watching the chaos of Richard Collins' downfall play out on television screens. The once untouchable tycoon had become the centerpiece of scandalous headlines. Phrases like Collins' empire collapses and billionaire arrested in corruption probe flashed across every channel. The moment Amy saw her father being led away in handcuffs, her tears came, silent and steady. Laura sat beside her, gently holding her trembling hand. But she knew these tears weren't born of grief. "It's over," Amy whispered, her voice tight and raw, yet edged with relief. "It's finally over." Laura pulled the young woman into a warm embrace, feeling her sobs shake through them both. "Yes," Laura murmured softly, "and you're free now." Days melted into weeks, and as they did, Laura watched something extraordinary happen. The timid, scared girl she had protected in the Collins mansion began to disappear, replaced by someone new, someone stronger. Amy's eyes, once clouded with fear, now gleamed with determination. The burden of her father's control had been lifted, and in its place grew a fierce resolve. Amy soon made a decision that would alter not just her own life, but the lives of countless others. With what remained of her inheritance after the investigations, she founded the New Hope Foundation, an organization dedicated to helping victims of domestic abuse and human trafficking reclaim their lives. When she approached Laura with her idea, hope shone in Amy's gaze. "Are you sure you want to do this with me?" Amy asked one evening, her voice laced with both gratitude and uncertainty. "You don't have to, you've already given me so much." Laura reached for Amy's hands, squeezing them firmly. "I want to," she said, her voice steady and resolute. "After everything we've been through, I feel like I've found my purpose. I can't imagine doing anything else." Tears welled in Amy's eyes as she threw her arms around Laura. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "For everything." Months became years, and the New Hope Foundation grew into something remarkable. It wasn't just an organization, it was a lifeline. Together, Amy and Laura poured their hearts into the work, helping women and children escape abuse, offering them shelter, legal support, and hope. Day by day, life by life, they rebuilt what had been broken. On a quiet, sunlit afternoon 5 years later, Amy and Laura sat together in the lush garden of the Foundation's headquarters. Roses climbed along the stone walls, their fragrance drifting in the warm breeze. A fountain gurgled nearby, its gentle rhythm adding to the peace of the day. Amy broke the silence first, her voice contemplative. She said softly, her gaze distant yet serene, "Sometimes I still can't believe it, everything that happened. How my life changed. How I changed." Laura looked at her, her heart swelling with pride and affection. Amy had become so much more than the frightened girl who once hid behind locked doors. She had become a beacon of hope for others, a voice for those who had none. "You've always been amazing," Laura said, her voice gentle but firm. "You just needed someone to believe in you, to give you a chance to shine." Amy turned to her, her eyes shimmering with emotion. She reached for Laura's hand, squeezing it with quiet gratitude. "And you gave me that chance," she said, her voice thick with feeling. "You risked everything for me, Laura. I'll never forget that." Laura blinked back tears, her throat tightening with emotion. "It was worth it," she replied softly, her voice catching. "Every single moment." For a while, neither of them spoke. They simply sat together in the garden, surrounded by the sweet scent of roses and the quiet hum of life. Laura tilted her head back, letting her eyes rest on the clear blue sky. Who would have thought, she reflected, that by saving someone else I'd find my own path? Amy stood then, brushing the grass from her skirt and turning to Laura with a bright smile. Ready to get back to work, she asked, her voice brimming with energy and purpose. Laura smiled, her heart full as she reached for Amy's extended hand. Always, she answered. Together, they walked back toward the foundation's main building, ready to take on whatever challenges the day might bring. The sunlight warmed their faces as they moved forward, side by side, like a promise of brighter days ahead. No longer were they maid and mistress, but equals friends, partners, and family in every way that mattered. Adversity had forged an unshakable bond between them, and hope had given them a purpose that stretched far beyond themselves. As they walked, Laura looked over at Amy, seeing the determination and compassion shining in her eyes. They had come so far, and while the road had been long, the future now gleamed with endless possibilities. Together, Laura thought, we'll continue to make a difference, one life, one soul at a time. The sun hung high, its golden rays spilling over the foundation like a blessing, as Laura and Amy stepped forward into the future undaunted, unshaken, and ready for whatever lay ahead. In a world where power can corrupt and silence the innocent, one brave woman's determination to help a young girl reclaim her freedom becomes a beacon of hope. Laura, a loyal servant, risked everything to save Amy, the daughter of a ruthless tycoon, Richard Collins. Trapped in a gilded cage, Amy was forced to live under her father's control, a life void of choice or happiness. When Laura uncovered Richard's dark secrets, fraud, blackmail, and illegal dealings, she refused to turn a blind eye. With the help of John, the gardener, they orchestrated a daring escape and faced unimaginable danger. Through fear, pursuit, and uncertainty, they never gave up. Together they exposed Richard's crimes and brought him to justice. But this is more than just a story of escape. It's about transformation. Amy, once a frightened girl, became a symbol of strength and hope. With Laura by her side, she built the New Hope Foundation, a sanctuary for those suffering from abuse and exploitation, giving countless others a second chance at life. This tale reminds us that even in the darkest moments, courage and compassion can ignite change. It's about how one act of kindness, one unwavering belief in another, can rewrite destinies. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with others who need a reminder that hope always finds a way. We'd love to hear from you. What part of Laura and Amy's journey inspired you the most? Share your thoughts, emotions, or personal reflections in the comments below. Your voice matters, and together we can continue to spread messages of hope, resilience, and change. Thank you for watching. And remember, even the smallest act of kindness can spark a revolution.